Hello gamers, welcome to Game Recaps. In this video, I will discuss the game The ER Patient Typhon. An atmosphere and exploration horror game that developed and published by professional villains for the Microsoft Windows platform and was released in April 21, 2021. This game will place the player as a young woman who wakes up in a hospital room without her arms. Just like her, the patients at the hospital also lost several limbs, which of course looks odd and raises suspicions about the terrible secret hidden in the hospital. So, what secret is hidden inside the hospital? Did she manage to unravel the mystery and escape from there? Let's find out in the ER Patient Typhon. At the beginning of the game, we will be shown the situation in St. Icaros, a hospital in Germany where there is a young female patient who wakes up without her arms, who I will refer to as Jane. Jane had just had surgery that required both her arms to be amputated to save her life. Jane can't remember what actually happened to her. A doctor named Victor, who is also the owner of St. Icaros Hospital, told Jane that the operation went well. In order to maintain immunity and a faster healing process, Dr. Victor does not allow family, relatives, friends, or anyone else to come to visit. Jane also still has to undergo treatment at the hospital for an undetermined period of time. After surgery, one of the hospital administrators, a bald man I will refer to as the Bald, took Jane to treatment room number 9. That night, Jane awoke after hearing the voice of a patient in the next room.
I heard when you arrived.
Whom I will refer to as John, asking Jane to speak because John felt lonely. However, Jane did not respond to John's conversation at all, because in addition to losing her arms, Jane had also lost her voice. Even so, John kept talking to Jane the following nights. The only thing Jane remembers was when Dr. Victor gave him a magic pill which was claimed to be able to regrow both her arms as before. Not long after, a nurse named Ono came to Jane's room and asked her to see Dr. Victor in his office. Jane rushed out of her room and realized that the patient who occupied the number 6 treatment room was secretly peeking out. When Jane peeked into his room, Jane found out that the patient had also lost a limb, which is one of his legs. Jane immediately realized that something was wrong with the hospital, especially when the hospital staff treated the patients like animals. Right in front of Dr. Victor, Jane meets an old crippled woman, whom I will call Granny, who tells Jane she doesn't remember either how she lost her legs, and then raves about how she wasn't happy at all in the hospital because the whole staff there treat them like animals. After helping Granny get a glass of water, Dr. Victor then summons Jane to his room, where he informs Jane that they found her unconscious after falling off a rocky cliff. Luckily, the Bald soon found Jane and took her to St. Icaros Hospital to be treated by a very competent doctor like himself. However, the fatal condition experienced by Jane caused Dr. Victor no other choice but to amputate both of her arms. The reason why Jane couldn't speak was because of the magic pills given by Dr. Victor to her, which can indeed affect a person's vocal cords. Dr. Victor tells Jane that she is currently in the emergency room of the St. Icaros Hospital, which is managed directly by the doctor without any interference from other parties, including the government. Furthermore, the emergency facility was built due to the economic crisis that had hit Germany since the Second World War, where Dr. Victor, with the help of a donor who poured quite a lot of money, founded the St. Icaros Hospital to treat and help economically disadvantaged people who need health care. After explaining everything, Dr. Victor then injects Jane's green serum and asks her to get some rest.
Back.
On the way to her room, Jane accidentally overheard the conversation of 2 patients, namely a female patient whom I referred to as Lisa, and a male patient whom I referred to as Leo. Lisa told Leo that she had seen a monster without legs eating a patient named Natasha alive. But Leo didn't believe Lisa's words because according to him, the patients who were no longer in the hospital meant that they had been sent back to their respective homes, as said by Dr. Victor. Leo assumed that Natasha was no longer here because she had been discharged like the other 2 patients, Mary and James, whom Dr. Victor had already been sent home in advance as they had fully recovered. Jane finally returned to the room after being scolded by the Bald, and as usual, John in the next room started talking to Jane again. John told about himself starting to lose his sight after Dr. Victor gave him a magic pill that was claimed to speed up the healing process, and according to Dr. Victor, his eyesight will soon return to normal. That night, Jane had a dream about herself feeling very hungry and continuing to eat the food on the table voraciously. The next day, Jane wakes up, and Anno tells her to have breakfast before seeing Dr. Victor. However, whatever happened last night, Jane sees a pool of blood pouring out through the gap in the door to treatment room number 4. In the dining room, Jane is reunited with Granny, who is again raving about herself losing her legs. Granny had no recollection of her accident, but according to Dr. Victor, Granny slipped and landed so hard that it crushed her leg. Luckily, the bald was near the scene and immediately took Granny to the St. Icaro's hospital. Hearing this, Jane became suspicious because what Dr. Victor said bears little resemblance to what he told her about the incident that happened to her, and thinks that Dr. Victor did make up these stories for the other patients. After breakfast, Jane immediately went to see Dr. Victor in his office. Shortly before Dr. Victor injects the same green serum as yesterday, suddenly a gunshot is heard.
Don't move.
Forcing Dr. Victor to come out and check things out. Being alone in Dr. Victor's room, Jane then checked the doctor's computer, where she found an email typed by the doctor. In the email, it is mentioned about Dr. Victor who cancelled the plan to transfer a patient who was dubbed as patient Typhon to another place. Dr. Victor reasoned that he had succeeded in creating something very promising. Jane thought that Dr. Victor was conducting an experiment, but the experiment is not explained further in the email. Immediately, Jane felt dizzy and she also felt very nauseous, and then vomited before finally collapsing unconscious. Jane then regained consciousness after Dr. Victor injects the green serum that she has always received regularly. The reason Jane fainted earlier was because she had not received the green serum at the appointed time each day. While on her way back to her room, Jane met the bald who was carrying a corpse. Jane realized that the pool of blood from patient number 4 had been cleaned up, and Jane once again saw patient number 6 peering out. Jane returned to her room, where she then heard John's screams sounding so miserable. John had coughed repeatedly and breathed heavily while complaining that his body could no longer move. John was also experiencing shortness of breath, and his stomach felt as if it would split in two. In the middle of the night, Jane awoke to the sound of John's screams, and to her surprise, the door was wide open. Not only that, the electric power of the entire hospital building suddenly went out. Jane then rushed to John's room and found John in a very pathetic condition. John is still alive, and then begs Jane to help him. To end John's suffering, Jane performs euthanasia, the only way to end John's life in a painless way. Seeing John's condition, which is very concerning, Jane finally realized that Dr. Victor had indeed lied to his patients. John told Jane that Dr. Victor gave him a magic pill which made him lose his sight. But actually, both of John's eyeballs had been gouged out, and both of his legs were broken from gunshot wounds, which explains the gunshots Jane heard while in Dr. Victor's room, and possibly the one who shot John was the bald. Whatever Dr. Victor's plan was, but all the patients in St. Icaro's hospital lost some of their limbs. Not only that, the patients also looked very strange, as if they had lost their sanity. The patient in treatment room number 8 was tied to the bed, while the patient in room number 6, the snooper, was seen no longer in his room. Jane found the patient in room number 5 crying, and patient number 4 not in the room, and it is possible that patient number 4 had ended his own life judging from the pool of blood that came out of the gap in the door of room number 4, and the corpse that the bald carried some time ago. Jane sees the patient in room number 2 end his life, and the patient in room number 1 being eaten alive by the patient from room number 3. Exploring the hospital area further, Jane entered the staff room and found that one of the power generators was off. In the same room, Jane finds a keycard that can be used to access locked rooms in the hospital. Using the keycard, Jane enters Area A, and is reunited with Granny, where the old woman informs Jane that she had eavesdropped on Dr. Victor, who ordered someone to go check on the patient Typhon.
Check on patient Typhon.
Granny also informed that the hospital's emergency exit was also locked. Believing that there is a computer that can open access to the emergency exit, Granny asks Jane to find it, because she suspects that something is wrong in the St. Icaro's hospital. It turned out that the computer Granny was referring to is in the staff room, but a password is required to activate it. Jane accidentally drops the keycard because she is surprised by the presence of patient number 6, the snooper. The snooper then helps Jane press the elevator button leading to the underground area, which must be done simultaneously. The elevator doors finally open. Jane and the snooper finally descend into the underground area, where the St. Icaro's Hospital's greatest secret is hidden. Arriving at the underground area, Jane heard the voice of Dr. Victor, the Bald, and Anno, who are worried about the current situation. The Bald informs that the electric generator has been damaged by something, and that's why all the hospital room cells open by themselves. The trio also talked about patient Typhon, where Anno claimed that something was wrong with the patient, so they had to seek help.
He's moving. We need to get help.
But Dr. Victor did not pay attention to it and ordered his staffs to clean up the mess that occurred. The Bald is ordered to find Jane's whereabouts and restart the power generator, while Anno is asked to hide in a safe place. Searching an underground area that looks like a laboratory, Jane finds some World War II records that reveal a bit of the secret behind the founding and operation of the St. Icaro's Hospital. The note was written by a Nazi named Hermann Typhon. On May 4, 1941, Typhon wrote about how he had just been accepted to join Project Typhon, which aimed to make super soldiers. The super soldiers they want to create are soldiers who can outrun enemy vehicles and can swim through canals to crush and annihilate entire resistance forces. On January 7, 1943, Typhon wrote about how his experimental subject had regressed, and he believed that some people were deliberately messing with his work. Therefore, Typhon accused one of his colleagues named Munch, who was considered a troublemaker. After reading the note, Jane then wandered aimlessly in the underground area, hoping to uncover the mystery behind the St. Icaro's Hospital. However, her most important focus is to find the main computer password that can open the emergency door access. But Jane's journey to reach her goal is not easy, because in the underground area, Jane has to face various traps and terrible mutant creatures that are ready to kill her. Through one of the notes left on the table, we learn that these terrible mutants are the result of experiments created from humans. A mutant that resembles a pig is the result of mixing patient Typhon's bodily fluids with a small amount of wild boar's blood. The experiment was originally meant to create super soldiers, but ended up disastrous. The Bald finally managed to restart the power generator, and is now looking for Jane. After safely passing through the pack of mutants, Jane reached Dr. Victor's room, where there is a voice recording made by Dr. Victor himself.
I am Dr. Victor West.
The recording was made on September 24, 2011, in which the doctor recounted the gruesome experiments he carried out. At that time, in 2009, an anonymous donor contacted Dr. Victor and asked him to continue his research on a study, namely the study of the healing process of human limbs. Seeing the offer with quite tempting funds, Dr. Victor agreed and started research to cure many people. In the recording, Dr. Victor mentions that he is reluctant to conduct experiments on humans. However, the donor continued to force Dr. Victor so that he would not feel guilty about conducting experiments on humans. The donor said that the subjects to be used in the experiment were people who were no longer seen by society and also lived alone in this world. So, at least if the experiment failed, no one would care about them. However, if the experiment is successful, then these people will find it very helpful. Dr. Victor was initially skeptical, but he immediately felt convinced to continue the research and work towards the experiment's success after seeing some of the patient's conditions were very concerning. Until now, Dr. Victor continued to carry out these experiments, and one of the most valuable experimental subjects for him was the patient Typhon. After that, Dr. Victor told the main computer password. Right after the audio recording ended, Dr. Victor entered the room, and upon learning that Jane was there and had learned the truth, the man rushed off. By smearing herself with mutant fluid, Jane was able to pass through the mutants in front of her with ease, and Jane arrived at the detention area, where a giant mutant was seen being confined in a cage. Outside the cage, there is a tag name that reads Patient Mary. The patient named Mary, who was claimed by Dr. Victor, had been sent home because she had recovered.
Mary went home the week after her friend, Jane.
It turns out that instead of being sent home, she was transferred to the underground area because she had turned into a mutant. More interestingly, Jane, who walks deeper into the area, then meets a giant mutant who can talk. The mutant is James, and he seems to be looking for Mary. It is finally revealed that the patient Typhon meant by Dr. Victor is James. Seeing Jane's arrival, James begged Jane to release him. The players will be faced with two choices: open James' cell door or sprayed poison gas. Opening the cell door could free James as well as endanger Jane, while spraying poison gas would kill James in his cell. Whatever the choice of the players will not affect the ending of this game. After learning everything, Jane went back up to the hospital ward of St. Icaros and then entered the password on the main computer to open the emergency exit access. Jane then finds Granny lifeless, and suddenly, a giant mutant known as Godzilla appears. Instantly, Jane's head felt heavy, and her strong arms suddenly grew on their own, and Jane finally fell unconscious. After that, Jane woke up in the basement cell with her arms chained to the wall, and finally found out that the accident Dr. Victor said to her was just a lie, because she was deliberately run over by the Bald and took her to the St. Icaros hospital to be an experimental subject. The Bald also told that all the patients in the hospital died because they were killed by Godzilla.
You helped that big thing kill everyone.
A giant mutant who came out of the underground area because Jane had messed up. Jane should be dead if Dr. Victor didn't stop the Bald from killing her. Using her stout arms, Jane managed to break the chains holding her back and get out of there. Now Jane has been filled with anger and is about to kill the hospital staff who had deliberately made her the subject of a terrible experiment. Seeing Anno being surrounded by mutants, Jane didn't care at all, even though Anno had told her that the medicine that could cure Jane's condition was in Dr. Victor's room. Anno was eventually killed by the mutants. Jane returns to the St. Icaros hospital ward while being chased by the Bald. The Bald fired a shot at Jane, but then Godzilla appeared and instantly devoured the Bald man. Right in front of Dr. Victor, Jane meets the doctor who tries to convince her to accept an injection and claims that the injection can cure her current condition. Because Jane no longer believed the doctor's words, Jane then killed Dr. Victor. Furthermore, depending on your actions, the game the ER, Patient Typhon will end with two different endings. The first ending is when Jane enters the doctor's office. She doesn't have the key to open the cupboard containing the medicine that can cure her condition. Therefore, Jane rushed to leave the St. Icaros hospital through the emergency exit. However, just as she was about to leave, two soldiers who were dispatched arrived, where they identified Jane as a monster and killed her. To get the second ending, we have to find 3 cupboard keys scattered at several points first. These 3 keys can be used to open the medicine cabinet in the doctor's office. After injecting the drug into her own body, Jane returned to her original state and rushed out of the St. Icaros hospital. 2 soldiers identify Jane as a patient and rush her out of there. Jane was released from the St. Icaros hospital, but was admitted to a mental hospital afterward. Probably because of Jane's story about mutants and the experiments carried out by Dr. Victor is only considered as bullshit, especially because Jane can't speak and can only explain it as it is. If anyone asks why Jane didn't let herself be injected by Dr. Victor, then the answer is that you would lose. Well, that's the whole story of the game the ER, Patient Typhon. Through various records of World War II relics, we know that a secret laboratory located underground is where the Nazis conducted various experiments to create super soldiers during World War II. The goal was to win the war and destroy the enemy troops. But they carried out these experiments on animals, not humans, as evidenced by notes written by a man named Joseph Boats, who clearly wrote that they carried out experiments on animals which became known as Project Typhon. Because the Nazis lost in World War II, since then, Project Typhon was stopped, and the secret laboratory located underground was left abandoned. Before finally, several decades later, a doctor named Victor West founded the St. Icaros Hospital right above the laboratory to help patients from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. Everything was going well, until in 2009, an anonymous donor contacted Dr. Victor to disperse large sums of funds on the condition that Dr. Victor continues the experiments previously carried out by the Nazis, or in other words, resume the long-abandoned Project Typhon. Over time, Dr. Victor no longer feels guilty about experimenting with humans and is even more addicted. Dr. Victor doesn't want to let go of his favorite patient, the patient Typhon, and always gets the candidates selected as his experimental subjects by telling the Bald to run over them and make it look like an accident, and take them to the St. Icaros hospital. They were later deprived of their memories and had several organs removed, and in Jane's case, she lost her vocal cords in both arms. The patients were lied to by Dr. Victor, who lured them into healing by giving magic pills, and periodically, they were injected with a special serum that could turn their bodies into mutants. One of the patients who experienced rapid development was James, who turned into a complete mutant and could still control his consciousness as a human. That's why James is called the Patient Typhon. There are still many unsolved mysteries of the game the ER Patient Typhon. One of them is regarding the identity of the donor who contacted Dr. Victor, who may be a retired Nazi soldier or anyone who knows about the Nazi project Typhon that was carried out during World War II. That's all for the discussion of the game's storyline, the ER patient Typhon. If you have other opinions about the storyline or mysteries in this game, feel free to write them in the comments column. Thank you for watching.